So this time last year, I was in Belfast. Now, many of you know that I lived in Belfast when I was a child. When I visit Belfast, I always stay in a part of the city that's known as the Cathedral District. From there, you can easily get around to most of the attractions that Belfast has to offer. Now, there are plenty of tourist attractions in the Cathedral District, but the real attractions, they're the pubs. Trust me, I've walked, some would say crawled, to some of the best pubs in Belfast, which is not surprising because, you see, I come from a long line of pub crawlers. My granddad was a legendary pub crawler. Granda loved a wee wander around the pubs of Belfast. He didn't mind walking, as long as you were walking to a pub or to the dogs. Fortunately for Granda, there was always a pub near the dog racing tracks. So when I wander the streets of Belfast, I do so haunted by images of my Granda, all done up in his best, walking with such purpose and determination. He walks with real purpose on his way out, but a little less sense of direction on his way home. My Granda has been dead for almost 40 years, but in Belfast, I can still see him in all of his old haunts. So when I'm in Belfast, every pub I go into, I enter with expectation, and I wonder what it must have been like when my Granda was sitting at the bar. Sometimes I actually see my Granda. I know that he's long dead, and I know that he can't possibly be there, but I can't help myself. The feelings are so overwhelming. Now, we don't actually have a word in the English language that captures the emotion that I feel when I walk the streets of Belfast. The Irish don't have an expression for it either. You have to go all the way to Portugal to find the word that describes this feeling. The Portuguese word is saudade. Saudade. And it doesn't actually translate into English. The best translation of saudade that I have ever come across is the presence of an absence, or sometimes presence through absence. Now, the word doesn't appear to make any sense. Maybe that's why we've never translated it into English. How can you experience presence through absence? Something is either present or it is absent. And yet, if you speak to anyone who has ever lost someone that they love dearly, they will tell you that the person's absence is so intense that they can actually feel that person right here, deep inside. When a mother loses a child, the pain of that absence is so intense that she can feel the child in her belly where she carried that child, deep inside. The absence is a presence. When a lover loses their beloved, the pain of that loss is so intense that the lost love is felt right here, deep inside. When someone we love is gone, they are still here. We see them here and there and everywhere. We catch glimpses of them on the streets. Sometimes we shake our heads knowing that what we see cannot be real, and yet we know that it's real. A loved one's absence can be so very present. Saudade. Through the absence, we feel a presence. Saudade. Now, I suspect that Some of you are thinking, and why wouldn't you? It's Easter after all. So maybe some of you are thinking, aha, I get it. This is how a progressive preacher explains away the resurrection. Maybe. There actually might have been a time when I would have tried to explain the anonymous gospel storyteller's accounts of Jesus' resurrection and tried to unpack the history and explain the reality of the resurrection as something like Saudade. I am, after all, a progressive Christian pastor, and you are all enlightened 21st century people with a pretty clear understanding of reality. There may be one or two of us who believe that Jesus physically rose from the dead, but I'm guessing that many of us don't hang our Christianity on the concept of the physical resuscitation of a corpse. As for this preacher, I'm with the Apostle Paul when it comes to resurrection. Questions about the nature of the resurrection were annoying to Paul, so much so that the Apostle Paul used pretty strong language in his letter to the church at Corinth. Listen to Paul. Perhaps someone will ask how the dead are raised. What kind of body will they have? And in very clear Greek. And Paul's not always so clear, especially in Greek. The Apostle Paul says, "What a stupid question." Like the Apostle Paul, my faith in the reality of resurrection does not hinge on the physical resuscitation of a corpse. So, if Paul, who wrote the earliest explanation we have of Jesus' resurrection, says that the sun has one kind of brightness, the moon has another, and the stars another, and stars differ from stars in their brightness, so it is with the resurrection of the dead, writes Paul. What is sown is perishable. What is raised is incorruptible. What is sown is ignoble. What is raised is glorious. Weakness is sown, strength is raised up. A natural body is sown, and a spiritual body is raised up. If there is a natural body, then there is also a spiritual body. I am with Paul when it comes to the resurrection. Saudade is not my way of trying to explain the stories of Jesus' resurrection. Saudade is my way of describing what it feels like to be a progressive Christian during Holy Week. After abandoning the notion that the divine source of all that is actually some sort of faraway person in the heavens who orchestrated the life and the execution of a person purported to be his only begotten Son, begotten, not made. Some sort of executioner so vile that we shouldn't even begin to contemplate the work of this executioner, lest we tremble, tremble, tremble. Well, once you come out of the closet as a 21st century progressive Christian, Holy Week is like a Saudade festival. Here, there, and everywhere I catch glimpses of the faraway sky god that I have long since stopped worshiping. The very absence of this kind of God is palpable. I see him, and I mean him. I see him everywhere. I know that the Father up there, that sky God, is dead. But he's still here, buried deep inside me, and he rises up to meet me all through Holy Week, which should not surprise me. After all, I love that old guy up there in the sky, truly, madly, deeply, passionately. I confess that I do miss him more often than I care to admit. There's nothing quite like him. No body can take his place. And now that he's gone, I can still feel his presence, even though I know that he is not here. God is dead. The Father God, the Sky God, the kindly shepherd that I was counting on to make me lie down in green pastures is dead. Our science, technology, philosophy, history, and our theologies have killed the personified deity that I both feared and adored. God is dead, and we have killed him. And the pain of that death is almost too much for me to bear. But I look upon the cross knowing that death will not have the final word. Death could not take Jesus from us. We know that despite humanity's most violent efforts, the cross could not take Jesus from us, and that death did not win because Jesus lives. So if death could not take Jesus from us, death cannot take God from us. Just because we have outgrown believing that our personification of God is actually God. This does not mean that the reality which we personified can be overcome by death. We personify all sorts of things. That's what humans do. And just because we stop personifying these things does not mean that they disappear. We personify hurricanes. But whether we think of them as Katrina or Andrew, we cannot destroy them simply by refusing to personify them. The force of a hurricane lives beyond our personification of the force. And while we grieve the loss of our Father, we know that death cannot take God from us any more than death could hold Jesus captive in the grave. Jesus lives beyond death in ways that his first followers could never have dreamed of or imagined. Our God, the one who lies at the very heart of all reality, will not be destroyed by the death of our various personifications of God, which have always fallen short of who and what God is. But we do not grieve as ones without hope, for we know that death will not have the final word. We know that when all is said and done, the grave can never, ever keep our God, who is love, from us. God is dead, sacrificed on the altars of our reality. And so, trusting that death will not have the final word, we come to the darkness of the empty tomb. Our questions, our ever-expanding knowledge, our technology, our endless quest for wisdom may have allowed us to evolve to the point where somehow the stone has been rolled away. But if we peer inside, we shall see the darkness. Darkness punctuated by strange stories that have the texture and the feel of rumor and innuendo. The kind of stories that spring up when people can't quite figure out what has happened. And just like the women who went to the empty tomb all those centuries ago, we too must face the darkness of such emptiness if we're going to move beyond our grief and our confusion. The darkness of the empty tomb was not what the followers of Jesus expected to find. The horror of the execution of the one they had hoped would lead them out from under the oppressive injustices of Roman domination and help them to usher in God's reign of justice and peace had shattered Jesus' followers and sent them scurrying into the shadows, afraid, confused, and wondering if God had abandoned them. We don't really have that much to go on, just a few disjointed, contradictory stories. But when you put these stories together with nearly 2,000 years of history of those who have experienced the life, death, and resurrection in their own lives, we know that something powerful happened to that ragtag group of followers that convinced them that death does not have the final word, that death could not keep Jesus from the world. Jesus was such an unusual character who lived so fully, loved so extravagantly, taught so radically, acted so courageously, that in Jesus, his followers were able to see the love that is God in the flesh. Each of Jesus' followers had been touched by him in ways that called them into a new way of living, a new way of being human, a new way of facing injustice, hatred, and violence. Jesus called them into a new kind of humanity. Jesus called them into this new humanity by living it himself, loving so freely and graciously, and abandoning what up until Jesus they had believed was the only way to achieve any sort of justice in this cruel world. Jesus renounced violence. In the face of military might, in the midst of the most brutal injustices, under the oppression of the mightiest empire the ancient world had ever known, at the risk and the cost of his own life, Jesus refused to take up a sword. Jesus' life and teachings brought them out of whatever hell they had been living in and gathered them together to learn together a new way of being in the world. Jesus' execution could not be reconciled with their hopes and dreams of a new world, a new way of living in what Jesus described as the reign of God. Jesus' message and his life could not be reconciled with his fate. Their darkness went far beyond the emptiness of the tomb. If their God could let the best of them die, such a horrible death, then perhaps their God was no God at all. Gradually, as the shock of their loss began to loosen its grip, they began to realize that the tomb was indeed empty, for it could not contain Jesus any more than death could take Jesus from them. Jesus lived in, with, through, and beyond them. They couldn't explain it. His presence was so very real. His impact on who and what they were continued to change and mold them into a new reality. The stories that have been handed down to us don't always satisfy our need to know exactly what, when, and how this all transpired. We live in an age that demands proof, and proof that Christ is risen cannot be found in an empty tomb. The proof that Christ lives is in the transformed lives of the millions upon millions of people who have made their way to the darkness of the tomb and come away not with proof that Jesus rose from the dead, but with hearts transformed by the emptiness of that tomb. So here we stand, at the edge of an empty tomb, peering in, hoping against hope that it is true, that death does not have the final word, that life can be lived fully, that love can be so extravagantly given, that God can be so wonderfully infleshed, that justice can be achieved, and that justice and not violence is the way to peace. We have come from the horrors of Good Friday, and we know that the world is still a violent place. On this very morning, news of the violence reaches here so quickly. And we know about the horrors of our history. And we can see in our own living rooms the evidence that violence and injustice still reign supreme as the people of Yemen, Syria, North Korea, Sri Lanka, and the dozen or so nations where unjust regimes continue to oppress, torture, and murder innocent men, women, and children. And we know that greed and hatred are the go-to responses of far too many of us, and that humanity has a long way to go before all of us have an equal share of the wealth some of us choose to squander in ways that are killing this very planet. We know that most of us are still so afraid of dying that we cling to all sorts of behaviors, even though they will ultimately fail to save us. So often we steadfastly refuse to risk giving up our tightly held beliefs because we're afraid that the darkness will overcome us. We know all this, and yet the life and teachings of Jesus bring us back to the emptiness of the tomb, where we continue to hope that God has not forsaken us, and that once again new life can spring forth, so that we too can be transformed and begin again to change the world. Every Good Friday, in addition to grieving the death of Jesus, some of us also grieve the death of the God whom we have worshiped and adored for most of our lives. We mourn the death of the personified God that was sacrificed on the altars of reality by our ever-expanding knowledge of the universe and of our own humanity. It's not easy to know how to move on after a loss that is so deep. For if this personified God is dead, and if we have indeed killed him, how are we supposed to make sense of this life without the one who has comforted us, inspired us, led us, and loved us in ways that have empowered us to become a people who want to share this God's love as we try to usher in this God's reign of justice and peace for all of our sisters and brothers? And so some of us stand dazed and confused before the darkness of the empty tomb, hoping against hope that even though the personified God we have worshiped and adored for so long is dead, that death will not have the final word, and that God is coming back to life. So today, as we peer into the darkness of the empty tomb, I hope that we can begin to experience the birth pangs of new life. For not even the death of the personified God will be able to keep the wonders of the one who is the source of all life from us, because the force that lies at the heart of all reality cannot be overcome by the darkness. Some of us are beginning to explore the divinity that is so much more than our personifications of God could ever express. We're beginning to touch and be touched by the one who is beyond the beyond and beyond that also. We are beginning to understand that the spirit of the divine is the impersonal, evolutionary impulse to become incarnate and emanate in every aspect of creation. We are beginning to learn about the various ways in which the force or the impulse or the spirit has been creating and recreating and incarnating the cosmos for 14 billion years. We are beginning to understand what it means to live freed from the notion that Jesus was sent to save us. We are beginning to realize what it means to live knowing that we don't need saving from some fallen state. Jesus wasn't about saving us from the past, but rather reminding us that we are ready because we are already the light of the world. We already possess the spiritual ability to evolve and to become. What Jesus taught us was what we are capable of becoming and how to begin becoming. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection show us the way to be love. And I'm not talking about our ridiculous ideas of what love is. I'm talking about the love that is the divine force that lies at the very heart of all reality. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection show us the way, not just how to love, but how to become love. And that, dear sisters and brothers, is resurrection indeed. Each and every time you or I embody Christ, love lives. Resurrection is the embodiment of Christ, or love, or God, or however you want to express the one that lies at the very heart of all that is. The love that is God is beyond our ability to imagine or to express. But that love lives in, with, through, and beyond us. And death will never have the final word. No matter how many times this cruel world tries to destroy love, love will live again, in, with, through, and beyond all of those who embody love. There's just one more thing that I want you to take notice of today, as love springs to life out of the darkness. Many of us have been trying to figure out exactly how we're supposed to live on now that we know that the personified God that we loved and adored for so very long has been put to death. So let me say this. And somehow it doesn't matter how many times I say it. People don't always hear it, so I'm going to say it softly, so you really have to listen. There's absolutely nothing wrong with personifying the one that lies at the heart of all that is. It's okay to personify God. Storytellers, artists, musicians, lovers, philosophers, scientists, poets, gospel writers have been doing it forever. Even Jesus personified the love that we call God, and we shall continue to personify that which we cannot express. We are, after all, human, and humans personified stuff. All the stuff that we don't understand. There's absolutely nothing wrong with personifying the reality that lies at the heart of all that is, just as long as we do not forget that our personifications aren't actually God. And we don't begin to worship those personifications as though they are God. For God is so very much more than our ability to imagine or express. The one that lies at the very heart of all that is beyond the beyond and beyond that also. Our expressions of the one will always fall short of capturing love's essence. The essence, the spark, the Spirit of God who is love and who is beyond love. That essence, that spark or spirit lives in, with, through, and beyond us. So on this day of days, let us rejoice because death has lost its sting. Christ is risen. Christ is risen in us. Hallelujah. Christ is risen, and the essence, the spark or spirit or Christ, however you want to express the reality at the heart of all that is. This reality lives in, with, through, and beyond us, beyond you and beyond I, deep inside us, so deep inside us. Christ is risen. Christ is risen in us. Hallelujah.